In this video, we'll discuss the following points and learn the easiest aspects of two-point perspective. This is another two-part video, and the second part will discuss the trickier aspects of this perspective framework. Make sure you spend 1 hour a day practicing the things you learn here until you can do them all. The link for this course's Anki deck is in the description, as well as a link to our Discord server so that you can help test if this is an effective way to learn these skills compared to more traditional approaches. The good news is that your work and hours spent studying one-point perspective were not in vain, and in fact most of what you learned there still applies here. Perhaps most importantly, the cone of vision here can be set up in exactly the same way, and while I recommend experimenting with the angle you use, the best results come from sticking with 60 degrees. Remember, you can make the drawing area inside the circle bigger by moving the station point down off the bottom of the page. Let's imagine we're standing in the middle of New York in a street lined with high-rise buildings, and somebody has placed a box in the middle of the street. Let's treat this as a one-point perspective setup for now. That is, the faces of the buildings and the cube that face us are orthographic, and the x and y axes feature no convergence. Only the z-axis converges, going back to our single vanishing point in the distance. Two-point perspective would occur if one of two things were to happen to this scene. The first is that we stay exactly as we are, head locked forward, and somebody comes along and rotates the box in the street on the spot, like a turntable. Now the box is no longer straight onto us, and we actually have convergence in two axes now, the x and z. The z vanishing point has now been moved along the horizon line, let's say to the right, and so the right side edges now converge towards it. But crucially, we have another vanishing point now, an x-axis one on the left side, and everything on this side now converges towards that point. So what about the y-axis? Well, here's more good news for you. Two-point perspective features no convergence in the y-axis. That means every vertical line in a two-point scene remains vertical. So these will be super easy to handle no matter where they appear on the page. You can turntable that cube all you want, but the vertical lines will always stay vertical. There is one more thing to notice here though. Look at the vanishing point for the buildings. It's still actually the one-point framework. The cube is in 2-point, but we're still looking ahead in 1-point, and the buildings are still conforming to that. And this is perfectly valid. We can mix 1 and 2-point together on the same page. In fact, as we'll eventually see, we could give every object in the scene its own perspective framework on the page. For now though, let's consider another way we might encounter two-point perspective. Back in 1-point land, we could never move our head. It was locked forward. But now we've gained the ability to turn our head left and right. We're still not able to look up and down, and this is why the y-axis demonstrates no convergence. But let's say we get tired of looking down this street. We decide to turn to our left and look at the corner of the left side building. We're also taking a few steps further down the street. Now the corner of this building roughly faces us. We still have our convergence down the original z-axis, but we also now have it in the x-axis. The z vanishing point is actually exactly where it was before, down that street. But because we've turned to our left, it appears from our viewpoint to have shifted to the right. And now this new one has appeared on the left side of the horizon. And you see how these changes are being introduced by rotation. Either we rotate or the subject does, and this rotation introduces more convergence. All converging lines must aim for a vanishing point. So what about the box? Let's say this time it never got rotated and it's still facing us square on from down the street. Because we have rotated relative to it, it too will now be in two-point perspective. The original one-point framework we had is now no longer in use, but it is still there. I'll mark it with red pen to show that it still exists, and we could still draw our one-point vanishing point, but it's not being used anymore. Nothing in the scene converges towards it. The box, because it's aligned with the buildings, is actually using the same vanishing points as the buildings for its convergence. But what about if now, as we look at the corner of the building, someone does come along and rotate the box on a turntable again? Well, now the box and the building each have their own two-point perspective framework on the page, and that means we have to draw multiple vanishing points, and once again, this is totally valid. Most beginner artists make everything in their scene aim towards the same two vanishing points, but in reality this is rarely what we actually see. Things are never nicely aligned, be it buildings or items on a tabletop, so remember that you might have to draw multiple vanishing points to handle a scene. We'll look at ways to accurately map these points and work out the vanishing points in the next video, but for now, just understand that the rotation of us or the scene items is what causes this, and what it causes is x and z convergence. The best way to learn this for now is to simply go and find pictures and photographs that demonstrate two-point convergence, like images of buildings, and trace the convergence lines to figure out where the vanishing points are. And it's by doing this that you'll notice the next key point. Normally, one of the vanishing points is not on the page. When most amateur artists set up a two-point perspective framework, they always fit both vanishing points on the page, and while this is possible, it limits the rotation that objects can demonstrate. In reality, we often end up with one face looking at us almost square on, and so one side will demonstrate far more foreshortening than the other. Face that is almost square to us is the less foreshortened one, and it will have a vanishing point way off to the side of the page, possibly not even on the paper. When copying these perspective setups, if you encounter a vanishing point off the page, you need to use your skill of aiming straight lines to visualize where the vanishing point is and aim for it. This is a skill that needs specifically developing. There is a way to make it accurate, which we'll see in the next video, but when drawing quickly, you don't want to get bogged down with measuring. Note that when we have a distant vanishing point off the page, the level of foreshortening isn't much. The lines are almost parallel, and so this actually isn't too hard to manage. When I freehand my boxes in 2-point, I draw the bottom of the box and then the vertical line, which remember is always vertical here, and then converge one side just a little bit. It's almost parallel. I aim for some vanishing points miles away off the edge of the table. I can then make the other side aim for a vanishing point on the page. The key thing to note here is that your box should feel like it has a 90-degree angle. Once again, we can measure this and make it perfect some other time, but for now, get intuitively good at drawing 90-degree angles in 2-point perspective. This is the mistake that most beginner artists make. They draw boxes that look too acute or too obtuse. The cone of vision can also cause this distortion to take place if you draw outside it, so remember to keep everything inside that safety circle. In fact, even straying near the edge of it can cause this distortion here in 2-point, so be extra careful. Can you draw a street scene in 1 and 2-point perspective and understand how your head rotation to the left or right causes X and Z convergence? Then you draw a 1-point perspective scene and then rotate a box in the scene into 2-point perspective. And you copy the convergence angles in photos you take or find to see where the vanishing points actually go and how one is sometimes off the page. Can you aim for the point off the page accurately to create convincing 2-point perspective scenes? 2-point is still not exactly how things appear in the real world, but you can hopefully see that it's given us the ability to rotate ourselves or the objects we observe on a turntable. And this is useful for drawing vehicles or props or environments where we want to demonstrate the length and width of the subject. And when we combine this with the eye-level tricks we know, we can also show more of the top of a subject, and so 2-point perspective is a good framework to pick for describing things. The limitation is that we cannot look up or down, so the more dynamic, comic book action scenes you might want to draw still won't be possible just yet. So to recap, you learned that 2-point perspective is just XZ convergence and is caused by us or the subject rotating, while the y-axis remains perfectly vertical. That we can sometimes mix and match 1 and 2-point, or even have multiple 2-points on the same page. That we can learn good rotation angles by studying photographs. That one vanishing point is often not on the page, and that we need to develop the skill of aiming accurately towards it. And that this framework is actually pretty good for describing objects and scenes. Make sure you can do the following before moving on to the next video. To make the challenge easier, really lean into those photo studies and trace them if you have to. Try and really understand that you have X and Z vanishing points to aim for. Just treat the Y lines as dead vertical, even if in the photos they appear slightly angled. You could also stick some more paper sheets off the edge of your sheet of paper to draw out the vanishing points that would normally be off the page if you get stuck. You might also wish to explore just setting up a scene with vanishing points equal distances from your center line. This would be the equivalent of looking right down the corner edge of a box, and while this does make learning easier, this type of viewpoint is boring and rarely seen, which is why I recommend doing the photo studies. To make the challenge harder, see if you can draw the room you are in right now, or your street, or some object you can see in 2-point perspective. This will entail picking a good viewing angle to describe the subject and probably aiming lines to a vanishing point off the page. Be sure to consider your eye level as well. This will really get you considering how to set up the best view of the subject, which is actually the important first step in deciding how the perspective in your scene will work. We want the subject to be easily understood and to look appealing. Spend some time making sure you understand how this is working. Next time, we'll revisit the station point and learn how to accurately plot these scenes, as well as manage the distant vanishing points we have off the page. Keep practicing, and remember there is an Anki deck available for free that recaps this lesson and schedules the practice for you. If you want people to practice with, I recommend joining this channel's Discord server, the world's biggest art learning experiment, where you can ask questions, get more challenges, and reinforce your learning amongst friends.